Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Beri Meric. I'm CEO and co-founder at Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you today to Martha Nussbaum. Martha, welcome. How are you today?
I am just fine, Beri. I'm really happy to be talking to you again.
Same here. It's great to see you. And I'm so excited for our discussion. For everybody joining us today, as you already know, Martha is one of the preeminent philosophers of our time. She's the winner of the Berggruen Prize for philosophy and the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. And today we're going to be discussing and exploring how we can reconcile the conflicting beliefs of a pluralistic society. We're going to be engaging critically with the concept of the global citizen, chart its rise and evolution from ancient Greece and Rome to the present, and explore why Martha calls this a noble but flawed vision of world citizenship. So we're going to have three parts in our conversation. First, we're going to learn about the cosmopolitan tradition and its shortcomings. Then we're going to explore Martha's frameworks for how we can reconcile the conflicting beliefs of a pluralistic society. And finally, last but not least, we're going to have audience questions so that we can dive in and make this truly interactive. So for everybody who's participating live, please think critically about what you're hearing, and any questions you have, anything at all, please type it into the Q&A box. And Martha and I will do our best to answer every question that comes up in the final part of this conversation. So without further ado, Martha, welcome once again. I want to kick off by asking you, what led you to write your latest work, The Cosmopolitan Tradition, a Noble but Flawed Ideal? And why do you think this work is particularly important in today's world?
Well, this is a book that I developed over many, many years, and I changed my views over the course of those years. But it really began when I started working at an international institute for development economics, which focused on India. So that's why we played the Indian national anthem. But my collaborator was the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen. And so that's why I focused on that anthem, which was written by the philosopher Rabindranath Tagore, great Bengali philosopher who had an ideal that really has inspired me all along. That is, of a world in which we're all focused on our humanity and the future of humanity in all people, and we respect the dignity of all people, and we don't view the barriers of nation and region as so significant. So what the anthem actually says is, we come from here and we come from there, we're from this religion and that religion, but all together we owe allegiance to the moral law, to Dharma. And that's basically the essence, I think, of the cosmopolitan ideal.
Excellent. Thank you, Martha. So share with us your particular definition of the cosmopolitan tradition so that we're all on the same page. And also share with us how its inherent tensions have evolved over time.
Okay, so the definition that I use, and it really comes from the tradition within Western philosophy that I follow in the book, is the cosmopolitan is one who thinks that the allegiance to all humanity is the most important thing and more important than attachments to family, nation, and region. Now, that's a very noble ideal in many, many ways. And it is what's behind the modern human rights movement, which is not just Western, but it is, as my reference to Tagore shows, it's fully international. It has its sources in many different traditions. But as the tradition developed, there are really four problems that it encountered, and I'll give them briefly, and you can ask me more about each one. First of all, it never had a very good account of material redistribution. It focused on war and peace, but not on the need for material goods. Second, it's too dictatorial. It tells people what they must think of as most important, whereas, of course, people come from many different views, many different religions, and they may well think that their own religion asks them to arrange the priorities somewhat differently. So I think it's a little too strongly prescriptive. Third, it doesn't make enough room, I think, for the nation. And I really want to elaborate on that, because there are forms of nationalism that I'm not in favor of, but there are some reasons to think the nation should play a central role in this ideal. And then finally, and this is the subject of my future and current work, it says nothing about animals and the world of nature. It says all human beings. And of course, we share this globe with many living beings and many sentient beings who all are thrown into the world as we are, and we deserve a chance to flourish. So I think it's short, its biggest shortcoming is in that area.
Thank you, Martha. Before we dive into these 4 criticisms that you have of the cosmopolitan tradition and your framework for dealing with them, share with us how the cosmopolitan tradition has evolved over time. So starting with the ancient Greeks and Romans, what has been its kind of trajectory, and where are we today in terms of the role that this plays in our current discourse?
Well, it has a pretty complicated trajectory because very early on, the Roman philosopher Cicero already made some of the objections that I'm making here. He said, actually, because your own republic is the source of your political voice and your associations, you really ought to give that a certain type of priority while still respecting the dignity of people in other countries. So in the end, I keep coming back to Cicero, but basically the Greeks thought really that national boundaries made no difference at all. We should all view ourselves as citizens of one big cosmic city. But then along the way, people noticed that this tradition focused on duties not to make war and to defend our allies if they're victims of aggression. And so our modern laws of war and the whole of the Geneva Convention is based on this tradition. So it's been very influential in that area, but it didn't say very much about what happens when people are hungry, when there's a drought and so on. And so along the way, philosophers, particularly the 17th century Dutch philosopher Grotius, and later Adam Smith in Scotland in the 18th century, started talking about the needs that people have for material goods. And Adam Smith even said that human capabilities, the word that I love because my approach is called a capabilities approach, but Smith actually used that word. Human capabilities are mutilated and deformed if people are hungry, if they don't have enough education, and if they're not healthy. So these material, social, economic rights started to be brought in. And so by the time we get to today, we have a well worked out human rights tradition internationally that still focuses pretty much on war and peace, violence and fraud. And we only have tatters and bits and pieces of an idea about how to make up the material inequalities. And it's very hard. I teach a course on global inequality every year where we try to figure out what on earth we can do about these staggering inequalities. The chance of where you're born in terms of what nation affects your life chances more than any other difference of race or gender or religion. So we have to solve that problem. And so we've evolved toward grappling with that problem, but realizing how very difficult it is. And I want to say, I think the capabilities approach that Sen and I have developed is now the kind of at the forefront. It says we don't rank nations simply by GDP per capita, but we have to look at what people are actually on the ground able to do and be. And so I set up a list of 10 capabilities, most of them material, life, bodily integrity, health, and many others. And we should try, not for complete equality because that would be too utopian, but for a threshold level of attainment in each of these capabilities across the whole world. So that's where we are today.
Excellent. So just my kind of key takeaways so far, it really is a question of who is responsible? Who do we have allegiance to? Who is responsible? And what is our minimum required threshold of responsibility? So it seems like that's what's at play here. And what you're sharing with us is that, yes, of course, it's a great, noble idea to have this allegiance to humanity at large. However, we still haven't fleshed out exactly what that means outside of the realm of war and peace and outright, kind of conflict and so forth. So let's take these like 4 challenges that you brought up. Let's take them in turn, and actually let's go into your proposed potential solutions for how we can ensure these minimum thresholds are met. So the first one you mentioned was that the cosmopolitan tradition doesn't adequately address material distribution. So tell us about that and how we can best address it.
Okay, well, first of all, we need the right theory of the goal. And we didn't have one in development economics. Nations were ranked simply in terms of GDP per capita in development economics. And so that would give large, high marks to nations that had staggering material inequalities. And of course, inequalities of other kinds, inequalities based on race and on gender. So the capabilities approach is a very material approach. It says we don't segment civil and political rights from social and economic rights. We think of the whole of a human life. What are people actually able to do and be? We focus on health, access to education. We focus on bodily integrity, the ability to cultivate your senses, imagination, and thought, the ability to choose your own way of life and choose activities that you have reason to value. We also focus on leisure because that's one of the biggest lacks of human beings in so many parts of the world, and particularly women, because they do a double day working in a wage labor, and then they go home and do all the domestic labor. But play and imagination are very important for cultivating your whole human personality. So anyway, we focus on the whole person, in other words, and then we have to figure out how to do that, what kind of transfers. Now, in my earlier writings, I had said that well, first of all, we'll get to the nation later, but I think nations have to be the starting point, and we have to give money in a way that's not too dictatorial and paternalistic. After all, people need the chance to say what they want to do with their money. So we don't just go into India and say, here, we're going to give you this program and so. But it turns out to be really, really hard. The economist Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in 2004, showed through his detailed comparative studies of health infrastructure in different parts of the world that what's essential for a good health infrastructure, I think we're seeing this today more than ever, is a good national system and political will to support that with tax dollars. And of course, if you give foreign aid and you say, oh, here's the money to float your healthcare system, it's not clear that's going to do good. He argues that it's usually counterproductive because it erodes the political will to sustain the health infrastructure. So in the end, what we can do is not so easy. And people seem to think that aiding others is very simple. We just give a lot of money, but it's harder than that. And I think the ways we can help others most are through technology transfer, knowledge transfer, communication, supporting the democracies around the world who are struggling with these problems, and so forth. But just the idea that, oh, we can cure everything by simply giving a lot of money away is an idea that now I think its time has passed. So basically, that's where we are. We're struggling to have a world in which everyone has an access to decent healthcare. We haven't even done that in our own country, for heaven's sake, and much less helping other countries. Access to education, access to digital technology, and all the things that are important in the modern world. So we're struggling with all of those things.
Thank you, Martha. So share with me, when you think of this, right, it's a constantly moving target, because if you were looking at by the standards of 100 years ago, the world is doing a lot better. However, when you look at the standards of today, there's still a tremendous amount of difference in terms of these capabilities. Is the vision here to, starting with the nation state, initiate programs that enables everybody to have a certain level, certain threshold level? And then how do you adjust that per country given their standard level? Or is that like a human level across all borders, each person? Because, you know, the average standard in one country is very different than the other. How do you deal with that?
Okay, so that is a question that always comes up. We have this Human Development and Capability Association. First thing we have to do is arrange the information in the right way. If you just asked about GDP per capita, you wouldn't get the information about health, about education, about women's access to protection from violence and so on. So a lot of our work has been just to get the information out there in a usable form, and then nations can use it in their own way. And then we can try in different ways, depending what the problems are, to assist other nations in raising their level. Now, I think it should be possible for all nations decently governed to attain the threshold level of all 10 capabilities. It's not that expensive if it's done efficiently and well. But in any case, so then the question is, do you adjust the threshold for where the nation is? Well, temporarily, you got to. Like if you say how many years of free public provided education should be constitutionally mandated. In the US, it's been K through 12 for a long time, and we're moving toward kind of free provision of community college, and we should really go up and up. India only recently constitutionalized K through 12, and it's not really provided in a lot of the nations. So clearing up the corruption and trying to get even elementary education universally provided is still a struggle in India. So, you know, each nation has its own struggle, but in the end of the day, because the labor market is changing and jobs that are out there need advanced skills to avoid worsening the inequalities, and we can see this very clearly in India, you have to make sure that education is as widely and universally distributed as possible. And so when in India only some people can get access to advanced computer skills, that will worsen the inequalities that are already there in the society. I think in the end, life expectancy ought to even out. And we can see, if you look at the data on life expectancy, it's jumped up all over the world. So we've had what Deaton calls the great escape from poverty, but of course, in some nations, much more than others. The United States doesn't actually do very well because we have such big internal inequalities. So we're only number 20 in ranking in terms of the whole bunch of capabilities. Japan and Australia and other nations do a lot, Canada do better. But anyway, we have to try to address both internal inequalities and then the global inequalities, which, as I say, are particularly tricky and difficult, because what we don't want to do is be a big ministry that dictates to people how they should live. We want to help them achieve these goals on their own.
So do you envision one day that just like there's the, the Geneva Convention on Conduct during war, that there could be like international resolutions, like a minimum required way that each nation has to provide capabilities? Do you ever see some of this being done globally? Or do you think, jumping to your third point, the third challenge, the role of the nation state here, or do you think the nation states will always have like the sovereign and primal role in making sure that these happen?
Well, the international discourse is already going on. And, we've got the Human Development Reports of the United Nations Development Program. They give you information every year on how the different countries compare with respect to these capabilities. We have our Human Development and Capability Association that has annual meetings and a journal that studies in detail particular problem areas. But do we want to mandate anything? Now, I think that at this point we have to say the nation is the locus. Why do I say this? Because the nation is the largest unit that we're aware of in the world that really gives people an adequate voice. As Grotius said, it's an outlet for their autonomy, by which we mean autonomos, the right to give people laws of their own choosing. And you just don't do that, even in the EU. It's not sufficiently an outlet for people's democratic autonomy. But it's also accountable to people. So if it goes wrong, the people can check it. This is just not possible with a supranational body. I've worked a lot in the UN system over the years, and I'm afraid to say it's a big failure in most respects. I think there's some agencies like UNICEF and UN Development Program that are a little bit better. But the problem is that the people who are appointed to UN posts are just appointed by the government in question. They're not accountable to the people that they're serving. They're not accountable even to the people of their own country. And so it tends to be a parking place for cronies, and it's a very inefficient and very corrupt institution. And I think that would always happen if you don't have a sufficient kind of political organization. Should we strive for a political organization that's transnational, like a world state? I don't think so, because every nation has such huge problems about voting rights, political accountability. I think we just magnify those problems if we throw it open to the whole world, as you can see from the corruption of the United Nations. So that means that we're stuck with figuring out how nations can cooperate to reach these goals. Now, the Millennium Development Goals of the UN, and that is certainly one good thing the UN has done, spell out some very important targets that we should reach in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, and so on. So that I think is the way we should proceed, holding ourselves accountable to goals and getting periodic feedback on how the different nations of the world are doing. But unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, sticking to the nation as the primary locus of political responsibility.
Excellent. Thank you, Martha. So the second objection you had to the cosmopolitan tradition is that it may come across too dictatorial, telling people what they think is, most important. The fact is, given that the nation state has to be the locus, and not every nation state is governed by a representative government, or there's different value systems at play as well. How do you kind of address this point about anything that's universal, like anything that you try to make into a universal attainment for all humanity? How do you stop it from becoming too dictatorial and more something that everyone can be bought into?
Well, I think you do it by saying, here's a minimum threshold that we can all agree on. And we can all agree on, no matter what our religion is, no matter whether we're utilitarians or Marxists and so on. And this is basically what the people who framed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually did. They came together from China, from Egypt, from Europe, and they realized that they did not share a comprehensive set of goals. Some were Catholics, some were Confucianists, and so on. And yet they could share a concept of human dignity that was not cashed out in terms of one particular religion, but it was common ground between them. And they could say, at any rate, this is a floor. We must not allow human beings in their dignity to be violated in certain ways. So, basically what I'm doing with the capabilities approach is just broadening that out to include the material goods. Here's the threshold that we can agree people should not fall beneath. But that doesn't tell you otherwise what to prefer. You've got a lot of space. We hope that that threshold doesn't occupy the whole of one's life. And so it's sort of like a tax system, Beri. So when you pay your taxes, you got some money left over, let's hope. And when you have money left over, you can decide to spend it on your children or your friends or anyone you happen to prefer. You can spend it on your church. So the tax system works out. What is it that we owe to one another? And that's the part that is taken away in taxes. And then the rest is yours to use as you want. And so just writ large, that's the basic idea.
Excellent. What are your thoughts on the concept of a universal basic income, which would provide people with a certain threshold amount to then go and make these choices on which capabilities they want to emphasize versus creating structural change that doesn't require for that?
Well, Beri, I don't think so well of it. It is a very popular idea, and it looks very democratic. But notice, first of all, if you give income to the household, it's very likely to be ripped off by the head of the household, who's in most parts of the world a male, and it disadvantages women. So there's that. And even if it's given to the woman, it may still be ripped off. But the other thing is that we've seen from cases where people do have a substantial amount given back in the form of income, that they don't support capabilities that are of great importance for the next generation. So think of the state of Alaska, which actually has given rebates, cash rebates to all its citizens. They decided they don't feel like funding the state universities. So, people are short-sighted when they have cash. they use it for themselves and their own short-term goals. Whereas in fact, our constitutional system says, you know, not just whatever you want every day is what you should do, but we should rather support as a group certain things that are for the common good. And that's what I think we should do worldwide.
Excellent, thank you. Before we go and hear about your kind of cohesive vision of how this can all come together, your fourth point, very interestingly, is that typically animals and nature, like all other living organisms in the world, doesn't always factor into our global vision. So how do you describe that shortcoming, and what are some solutions that you've thought about?
Well, this is something that began to be noticed very early, in fact, because now the Stoics, where this tradition started, really had contempt for animals. They used the word brutes, or the Greek equivalent, and they just thought animals had no intelligence at all. But most Greek philosophers actually didn't think that way. In fact, the Greek tradition contains some of the most advanced thought on behalf of animals, in Porphyry's on abstaining from animal flesh, one of the great works of vegetarianism in the tradition. But then, of course, there are other non-Western traditions, Buddhism in particular, that have a very sophisticated sense of the whole world of nature, Hinduism too. So we learn and we evolve. And Grotius in the 17th century already said that the earth is a kind of common possession of us all, and we should take thought for its own integrity, and what we don't give each person rights to grab and spoil parts of the earth. And then Kant actually, although he wasn't particularly in favor of animal rights, but the American philosopher Christine Korsgaard, a Kantian, has used his ideas to say, look, Kant recognized that we're all thrown into the world together, and this gives us a common set of problems, and no one should dominate over others with respect to the basic solution to those problems. So what Korsgaard adds is that we consider that animals are in the same pickle we are as humans, thrown into the world along with us, and we should just realize that and cooperate in such a way that animal species are preserved, that the environment is preserved, habitats are preserved, and so on. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Excellent, thank you, Martha. So having gone through the key challenges to the cosmopolitan tradition, I'd love for you to share with us like your vision, okay? So looking ahead, looking at our world today and looking at where we can be, what do you think, like how does like this ideal evolution go from here based on the progress we have made so far? What do you think the critical next steps are, both within nations and globally? And then what's the end goal? And maybe you can start there. Like, what's the society that you envision, the cosmic city that you see? And then how do you think we can close the gap in the best way?
Yeah. Well, I think we always have to work in two places. In our own nation, because every nation has internal inequalities that are troubling, ours perhaps more than most. But so we have to keep working in our nation to make sure that everyone has access to the capabilities on my list up to some reasonable threshold level, plus the protection of animals and the world of nature. And of course, that leads us outside the nation almost right away, because animals don't observe national boundaries. And so treaties are a very important part of animal law. But then so each nation has to do this work, but then we also have to foster the efforts of other nations that are struggling. And as I say, I think it's not easy, because we can't do this simply by throwing a lot of money at it. Even if we wanted to have triple the foreign aid we now give, that probably wouldn't be the right way to solve the problem. So each of us, I think, just has to think, what can I do as a human being to foster, let's say, a nation like South Africa that has an admirable constitution that's pretty much enshrined the capabilities approach, but it's too poor to live up to that constitution? How can we help that nation? And I think it's not by just throwing a lot of money, but it's rather by technology transfer, knowledge transfer, by having whatever our profession is, whether it's law, whether it's medicine, doing something to cooperate with the other nations in addressing problems. I have colleagues right now in the University of Chicago Law School, who are working with India to address the COVID crisis. There are others who are working with other nations. And I think this is what we can do for one another. Our University of Chicago Center in New Delhi, we have one in Rio, one in Beijing, and so on. This is for scholarly cooperation. It doesn't teach courses, but we're there to learn, but we're also there to give. And we try to help nations address their problems. And then let's hope that in many years, the world would not only be a world of peace, which is something the tradition had on its mind from the beginning, but a world in which no one's life chances, no child, would be blighted by lack of access to medical care, lack of access to education, lack of political voice, discrimination on grounds of race, religion, gender. I mean, all of these things are pretty hard, and it's not, we shouldn't get discouraged if it doesn't happen in 200 years, but we keep working on it, and that's where we're going.
Excellent. So just to summarize from my perspective, you're saying, you know, we've got our work as we're thinking as individuals, as leaders, as members of our respective communities. What can we do in our nation so everyone has these capabilities that you mentioned, but also how do we support other nations to get there? And it seems like it would be in everyone's best interest, whether in a commercial perspective or just on a moral basis too, for everyone to be doing as well as possible, because our fates are intertwined, even if we're in different countries. So you, just to get it though in a kind of a crystallized form from you. So do you believe that after, let me put it this way. A, do you believe this is achievable ultimately? For those who might say, well, that's too utopian, we're never going to get there. Do you actually believe like, nope, it's just a matter of time, just as we can have potentially global peace, we will be able to have these? Or do you think it's just going to be a constantly, something we constantly aspire to? And yeah, like, I guess regardless, it would also be good to know like where you see like it just being a matter of time versus where you're most concerned about us falling short, given the specifics of human nature.
Well, you know, as a feminist, I have to be quite optimistic, because if you look at where women were in 1900 and where women are today, not just in the United States, but often in other countries, women are even doing better relative to men than they are in the United States. The first female delegate to the United Nations was actually a woman from India. So we recognize that tremendous progress of half of humanity has already taken place. So that gives us hope that this can actually happen. For a long time, there was no concern for environmental protection. Now there's tremendous concern, and I would say it's one of the greatest things that young people, the students that I teach, are thinking about. So we have a lot of reasons for optimism. And after all, I set up the goal in not a utopian way. I don't say that everyone's life chances have to be precisely equal. It's just a reasonably high threshold that gives opportunities to everyone in the world. So I think that should be doable. But I also know, and my other area of philosophical work is on the emotions, that human beings are prone to outbreaks of fear, outbreaks of disgust at other people. And so, you know, the fight against ourselves, particularly against disgust for other people who look different from ourselves, which is probably in our evolutionary heritage. There are reasons to think that we're the sort of animal that clings to the ones they know and has disgust for the ones they don't know. So all of that is our baggage as human beings, and we have to keep struggling with it. And you know, only to the extent that we successfully struggle with ourselves can we advance toward the goals.
Absolutely. And perhaps like children becoming adults, maybe this is a process of growth for us as humanity, where we are actually learning from our mistakes, we are making progress, and maybe we can control those evolutionary, you know, kind of leftovers from the past. And having a framework like this, where we can actually aim for specific capabilities for everyone, could help us guide our emotions and efforts in the right way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That you have to have the right framework, and you have to have the information out there in a usable form before you can address your own problems and your nation's problems and the world's problems in a productive way.
Excellent. Martha, we've got, this has been amazing so far, and we've got some great audience questions coming in already. So I'm going to dive into those. For everyone participating live, please, if you have any other questions, type them into the Q&A box over the next 5 minutes or so, and we'll do our best to get to them. So I'm going to kick off with a question from Michael Levy, who asks, how do you factor in corruption very often on a grand scale into your plan to help nations needing help, such as South Africa, for example?
Well, it is one of the hugest problems, absolutely. And this is one of the reasons why Deaton doesn't think that just giving cash is going to be very useful. So he says, even if there's no corruption, it still wouldn't be very useful. But yeah, corruption is very often a problem. And we see this even at the level of education. My collaborator, Amartya Sen, when he won the Nobel Prize, he set up a trust to foster education in West Bengal, his home state. And he found that in his even 3 districts near where he was born, the teachers don't show up 20% of the time. And then not only that, but when they do show up, there's this industry of what's known as private tuition, where, you know, the wealthy kids pay the teacher to come teach at their home after school so they can do well on the tests. And then, of course, that means the teacher has an incentive not to teach in the school, because then the inequalities would not show up. And so, you know, educational corruption at that level is terrible. It holds back everyone. And that is endemic in lots of the world. I think South Africa actually less, but it's still a problem in South Africa. South Africa had the problem that the education system had been thoroughly wrecked under apartheid. There was this law, the Bantu Education Act, which sent Black children to separate schools where they basically didn't learn anything, and white kids to schools where you did learn something. And so they couldn't just take the same system and make it more egalitarian. In Botswana, they could, because all they had to do, the British had set up a pretty good system, all they had to do was integrate it and make it racially equal. And you see, if you compare the 2 nations, that in Botswana, there's a uniformly high level of basic education. If you go as a tourist to Botswana, as I have, you find that even people who are tour guides and have excellent fluency in English, and they really do a good job of making them apprised of the history and the geography of the nation and so on. So if South Africa could get to where Botswana is, that would be great, but it will require a lot of undoing. And so anyway, each nation has its own problems. But how can, Amartya just tries to think, how can I get the teachers in my own hometown to teach in the school? And basically he used his political clout to lobby the teachers union, which is very powerful and very corrupt, to come out publicly against private tuition. Whether they're enforcing it is yet another matter, but you know, that's a first step to get the unions on board with this goal, which they weren't. So every problem is different, and you just need a lot of knowledgeable people who address the problems of corruption in each region where they're working. And I'm afraid I can't say anything simpler or more elegant than that.
Thank you so much, Martha. Next question is from Armando Beltran, who says, good morning. It's a privilege to listen to Martha. Thank you. And his questions are as follows. 1, what are your thoughts on effective altruism? 2, what are you currently researching, and how does it contribute to your current thinking?
Okay, well, the effective altruism movement, we certainly need to continue debating this, but it has the problems that Deaton identified, namely that it focuses on transfers of money, and it doesn't really ask how that affects the internal political will of people in each area. And what Deaton did was to study the different Indian states. It's a good experimental, natural experiment, because they are in charge of health in each state. It's a institutional health as a subject to be addressed by the state. And the states that are doing well are not the richest states. They're the states where politics has brought people together to support public goods, in particular Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Now, so he concludes from his lengthy studies that giving cash is not going to achieve the goal. And in fact, it may actually undermine the goal, because the minute the people of Tamil Nadu say, oh, all this cash is coming in from rich people around the world through the effective altruism movement, then they will relax their political efforts to sustain the health infrastructure. So that's the problem. Now, of course, there are other things that that movement has suggested that are more concrete, like giving malaria nets and so on. Sometimes that more specific targeted aid will work, although there's evidence that sometimes the malaria nets are used for fishing nets and other purposes. But the more targeted the aid is to a specific use, the more helpful it is. If it's targeted to one particular disease, that's better than if it supports the health system as a whole. But in the end of the day, what you really need to sustain health over time, as we see from COVID very, very clearly, is a functioning system of primary care, of hospitals, and of course, attention to public nutrition and the development of good health practices at a population level. And, you know, I just think it's too easy and too knee-jerk in the effective altruism movement. It doesn't address the problem where it really is on the ground.
Thanks so much, Martha. Next one is from Eduardo Garza, who asks, how do you believe the housing problem should be confronted? I believe housing is a medium to ensure a lot of the capabilities on your list.
Absolutely. And I can tell you that the countries and states that have done well have paid a lot of attention to housing. Just to give you Kerala as an example, since that's the place where I've done a lot of my development observations, they have a policy that any unused dwelling can be squatted in legally by any poor person who needs a dwelling. And the state then undertakes to provide indoor plumbing for that squat and so on. So the woman I particularly profiled in my book was a poor bricklayer who had nowhere to live, and her husband had an accident and he couldn't work. But they squatted in this unused dwelling, and then the state took care of plumbing, but also access to education and so on. So there are different ways of doing it. I would say, going back to South Africa, although they complain a lot about how they're doing with the housing problem, what I observed was not so bad. And so they took me to these squats outside of Cape Town, and they were very apologetic, the development activists, saying, you know, look at these squats and how badly people are doing. But actually, most of them had indoor plumbing, and the ones that didn't had a porta potty right outside. And they all had access to electricity. So they're not doing too badly, considering the huge number of people who migrate from the rural areas to the cities in search of employment, compared to squats that I've seen in India, in the not in Kerala, but in other parts of India. You know, they're actually doing pretty well. And rural India has a tremendous number of problems to confront, including the fact that most dwellings still burn cow dung as the primary fuel, which ruins your lungs, and it doesn't heat the house and so on. So anyway, you know, I think that we're doing better in some parts of the world than others, and it takes an effective public policy. And of course, South Africa has had a very good housing policy ever since Mandela's election, so that's not surprising. It solved the housing problem a little bit better than the education problem. India has really not dealt with this adequately, partly because some states care about it and other states don't. Some states think that the economic growth is the main thing we should pay attention to. So some states have improved economic growth, but they haven't done much for the poor in terms of access to housing. So it's very uneven all over the world. And I agree with you that it's a key part of people's decent level of life.
Excellent, Martha. Thank you so much. Next one is from Rob Keeve, who asks, what do you think is the right model for nations to collaborate and engage to upgrade or replace the United Nations? How can it be designed more effective, to be more effective and more reflective of today's thinking?
Well, I don't want to get rid of the UN entirely. I think it's a good forum for people to meet and talk. I don't hold out much hope for the Security Council and the General Assembly, but I think there are particular agencies that are better than that. As I say, I think UNICEF is a very good basis for all kinds of health work all over the world for children. So I would certainly want to strengthen that, and I would want to strengthen the UN Development Program is pretty good, and the what's called UNIFEM, the agency that works with women's entitlements. So I think basically international meetings and international talk may, in the first instance, be just talk, but they're a great source of political motivation and political will to address the problems in the nation. So if we look at the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, in the first instance, that's just talk. It's supposed to be a law, but it's not enforced. So what's it all about? But you see that in order to get there, women were brought together from all over the world. They met together, they shared their problems, they shared possible solutions, and this coming together of women then funneled back into political mobilization in each nation. So that's what I think these supranational bodies are mainly good for. I think there are others that are more, have more teeth, like the World Court, the International Labor Organization, the World Trade Association. But the UN and its the various international documents, I think their primary role is to carry on discussion and deliberation and jumpstart mobilization and efforts in each nation.
Thanks so much, Martha. Very, very nicely said. So next one is from Joseph Wayne, who asks, or states, this is a bit longer question, but I'll just read it out so we have the full context as an audience. Joseph says, Thomas Sowell in Conflict of Visions outlined what he described as the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision, which are the two competing frameworks of political thought. So Sowell argues that unconstrained vision relies heavily on the belief that human nature is essentially good. Those with an unconstrained vision distrust decentralized processes and are impatient with large institutions and systemic processes that constrain human action. They believe there's an ideal solution to every problem. Sowell argues that the constrained vision relies heavily on the belief that human nature is essentially unchanging and that man is naturally inherently self-interested regardless of the best intentions. Those with a constrained vision prefer the systemic processes of the rule of law and experience of tradition. Compromise is essential because there are no ideal solutions, only trade-offs. So the question is, which vision do you subscribe to? Do you believe your work strengthens one or the other?
Okay, well, I haven't read Sowell, so let me put it in my own words. The tradition that I examine has its own way of thinking about our constraints. And for a long time, people thought that limited sympathy is the primary obstacle. So in other words, we're narrow, we don't think much about other people and what they need. But if we just broaden our vision, then we will do that, because once the blinders fall from our eyes, we will all address these problems. Now that's what a lot of people thought all the way through the 19th century. John Stuart Mill thought we should send people to schools that cultivate this universal vision. He called this the religion of humanity. He learned this from the French philosopher Auguste Comte, that we would learn then to foster the future of all humanity. Basically, Tagore in India had the same idea. He thought, well, now is the time when we can all learn from each other, get together, and expand our narrow vision. However, Tagore was wiser than those others. He saw something else. He saw that human beings have a naturally ambivalent relationship to their bodies. They have a tendency to have fear of death, and that leads them to have disgust with bodily waste products and with the signs of our mortality, corpses, and so on. So I've done a lot of work on disgust, and I think Tagore is absolutely right. Now, what does he propose to do about this? Well, here he's rather cagey, because he can't frankly say what he wants to say in polite Victorian society. But basically, he holds out a group of countercultural minstrels called the Bowels of Bengal, whose idea is we're all supporting one another and we don't accept any barriers. But what they particularly want to do is to undo bodily disgust. The initiation ritual for a bowel is to taste all the fluids of the body. So this is what Tagore doesn't quite say openly in The Religion of Man, but he gestures toward it. And in fact, Amartya Sen's grandfather was asked to publish in The Religion of Humanity a special learned article on the bowels, which was reticent, but it gave you the basic idea. Now, how can we unlearn our disgust then? You know, it's the source, I think, of a lot of bad stuff. It's the source of othering of various pernicious kinds. A lot of disgust in racism, a lot of disgust in sexism, and of course, that also works internationally. So when we hear that other nations are shithole countries, that they're vermin, that's disgust speaking and othering and subordinating. How can we overcome that? Well, we probably are not going to exactly taste all the fluids of the body, but I have to say that we can learn a lot about how to recognize that we are bodies, how to honor our bodies from the arts. I think the arts are a big part of undoing disgust, because when you dance, you have to recognize that you are a body and that sweating isn't so evil and so on. And you can learn this in many other ways, but undoing disgust is a big challenge. I actually have a comparative project with our center in New Delhi where we had a big book, and you can find it, called The Empire of Disgust. It's a co-edited book that looks at all the different types of disgust in India and in the United States. The caste hierarchy, American racism, gender-based disgust, disgust towards people of different sexual orientation, trans disgust, disgust toward aging people. So we look at all these different forms. And of course, one part of it is to see how irrational this all is. We're all bodies and we're all bound for death together. If we can only face up to that, that's the beginning of progress. But in any case, we think that studying at least puts the issue on the map. And in bringing up children, there's a lot that you can do to teach them. Well, of course, first of all, not to teach them disgust at other groups and other genders and other sexualities, but to teach them a love of the body in themselves and in all people. And of course, I would extend that to a love of the animal bodies. I think one reason we are afraid to care so much about animals is that we recognize that they are mortal animals, and we don't want to recognize that we are mortal animals. And so we segment ourselves and we say, oh, we're angels and they're just animals. So anyway, that's a big task, and we ought to start thinking about it.
Beautiful said. Thank you, Martha, so much. One quick one from Amar Charani, last question from the audience. When you think about creating a framework toward the future, how far in the future do you think?
Well, you know, I think there's all this tendency in philosophy to say that so-called ideal theory is bad and we should just think about where we are. But actually, not even my friend Amartya, who does attack ideal theory, not even he sticks with the here and now, as it turns out, because he thinks human rights goals are long-term goals. And they're not immediately achievable, but it's good to hold them out there. And so I think we have to work at both levels. We have to say, well, where are we now and what can I do? Because to have hope, we have to have a sense of immediate practical engagement, but we also have to have a roadmap of where we want to go, where we're not going to direct our efforts in the best possible way. So not maybe 1,000 years, but maybe 100 years, and work back and forth between those two.
Thank you so much, Martha. So many of the speakers we've invited here, no matter what their background is, whether they're business executives or people in the arts, researchers, many talk about the importance of this idea of a North Star. So I want to thank you for helping us crystallize a better version of a North Star and refine our version of that. To wrap up, I want to ask you to just take a minute or two. We've got like 2 minutes left here, to just share with us again, like that vision you have for the future. Like, what does that world look like, and what does its constituents have, and how, you know, we don't need to compare it to our current world, but just to leave us with that kind of a vision that you have. And then finally, if there's anything we can do to support your particular endeavors, how we can get engaged and how we can best support your work, and we can wrap up with that.
Well, what I imagine is a world in which there's a cooperative group of democratic Republican nations, each one not a tyranny, but a genuine democracy, who put their heads together and try cooperatively to solve the big problems that humanity faces. And that includes trying to address the problems within ourselves. So education needs to focus, I think, very much on the arts and humanities, because that's a way of coming to terms with who we are and what we might be. And so I guess what can people do? I think the first thing is learning as much as possible. Americans are woefully ignorant about the rest of the world. And so just a lot of learning. In my class on global inequality, I insist on spending 2 full weeks on India just to have one case study where people really know the history and all the regional differences and so on. So learning, but then thinking, well, how am I placed? What are my skills? Is my best contribution to raise children who are non-racist and who support human rights? Is my best contribution to teach? Is my best contribution to write? Do I have a technical skill that I can impart to others in some sort of cooperative project? And our Human Development and Capabilities Association, which you can find online, is a coming together of mainly scholars, but also activists from 80 different countries, about 2,000 people. We have annual meetings, a journal. So that's one thing you could look up and get some information and maybe take part in our association.
Thank you, Martha. I love the call to action to just like really reflect on what's the best contribution I can make. And I'm, on behalf of everybody, I think I can say we're very excited to dive deeper into the capabilities approaches you've developed. And today was not just inspiring, but also truly galvanizing to do better in a very positive way. So thank you for being here. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Beri. It was a tremendous pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you, Martha. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Wishing you all a great week ahead and all the best. Take care. Take care, Martha. Thank you so much. See you again soon.